Okay, let's dive in. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're heading back to the American Progressive Era. It's quite a fascinating period. And we're looking at this figure, Samuel M. Golden Rule Jones, mayor of Toledo, Ohio. Seems almost contradictory, doesn't he?
He really does. And our job today, well, it comes from a listener who sent us a bunch of sources. They need help figuring out if Jones is, a worthy namesake for a political activist award, like a 2025 award.
Right. Is he still a true progressive for today's standards? That's the question.
Exactly.
So, our mission: go through these sources, articles, historical accounts, the lot, pull out the key stuff. We need to get a handle on his world, his philosophy, what he actually did, who was he up against, where did he win, where did he fall short.
And then, importantly, look at all that through a modern progressive lens.
Okay.
So we'll start with the area itself, set the scene. Then trace his pretty unusual journey, poverty, to becoming quite wealthy. See how this golden rule idea wasn't just talk? He actually tried to live it, first in business, and then tried to run a whole city that way, often against, well, some really fierce opposition.
We'll definitely get into the political fights. The specific reforms he pushed, some sound pretty surprising, actually. How he handled the big social issues back then, the complexities we see now, the criticisms.
Yeah, all of it. And then bring it together to help you, our listener, make that assessment for this award.
It's quite a story. A rich industrialist becomes this champion for the working class, takes on the political machines.
And tries to run a city on do unto others as you would do unto yourself.
Yeah.
Simple, but wow, radical.
Okay, setting the stage. The Progressive Era. Roughly, what are we talking about here? Late 1800s, early 1900s?
Yeah, roughly 1890s to the 1920s. And it was just explosive growth in the U.S., but also massive chaos. You've got factories popping up everywhere, cities swelling, huge waves of immigration.
Which sounds great, but it led to incredible wealth next to, like, terrible poverty, right? Slums, dangerous jobs.
Exactly. Exploitation was rampant. And the political system often felt broken, or worse, corrupt. Powerful monopolies, crooked city governments.
So the progressives were the reformers trying to fix all this.
Pretty much. A really diverse bunch, actually, pushing for big democratic changes, direct primaries, electing senators directly, letting citizens propose laws or vote
Things
on
like
them.
initiative and referendum.
Right. And women's suffrage was a huge part of it, too. They wanted to use, science and expertise to solve problems, regulate big business. Jones is part of this, but he's different.
And his background is really key to why he was different. He didn't come from money.
Not at all. Samuel and Jones, born in Wales, 1846, dirt poor. Family came to New York when he was just 3, almost no school, working basically his whole childhood, farms, sawmills, boats.
A real tough start.
Absolutely. Went out of the Pennsylvania oil fields at 18, failed at first, which is important. He knew what failure felt like. Saved up, went back around 22, spent 15 years just working his way up from the bottom rung right up to being an oil producer.
So he really knew the industry inside and out, from the labor side, too.
Yes, exactly. That hands-on experience, it's crucial. Then he moves to Ohio in '86, co-founds the Ohio Oil Company, which eventually got bought by Standard Oil.
Ah, Standard Oil.
Right. And he patents this improved oil pump in 1891. That kind of cemented his fortune.
Okay, so he becomes this wealthy industrialist. But unlike a lot of them, his background seems to have really shaped his views differently.
That's what's so fascinating. Instead of just adopting that survival of the fittest mentality, his own experience with poverty, with hard labor, it seems like it gave him real empathy. And eventually a deep critique of the whole system that created so much inequality. He'd seen the human cost firsthand.
And this really crystallizes after the Panic of 1893, big economic crash.
It does. The whole country got hit hard, Toledo included, where he lived then. Mass unemployment, real suffering. And Jones, even though he was rich, was apparently just deeply affected by the misery he saw. So in 1894, he decides to start his own company, the Acme Sucker Rod Company, to make his invention.
And this Acme place becomes legendary, right? Not just for the product, but for how he ran it. The sources call it a crucible for his golden rule idea.
Yeah, it's where he really put his money where his mouth was, so to speak. They say the only rule posted anywhere was just that, the golden rule. Do unto others as you would do unto yourself.
And the actual practices, the sources list things that sound, well, almost unbelievable for the 1890s.
Truly remarkable.
Yeah.
Wages, for instance. He paid $1.50 to $2 a day. The average was maybe $1, $1.50 if you were lucky.
Big difference.
Huge. And apparently when someone asked if he could afford it, he basically shot back, what's that got to do with what we can afford to pay? Like, it was about a living wage, not just profit margins.
Wow.
And get this, women got equal pay and benefits.
Equal pay in the 1890s. Seriously.
Seriously. And he brought in the 8-hour workday. Most folks were doing 10, 12 hours easy. He thought shorter hours meant better work, less drinking,
Makes sense.
plus paid vacations and holidays.
Yeah.
Practically unheard of back then.
Paid vacation. Good grief.
He even had profit sharing, like a 5% Christmas bonus every year. Believed workers deserved a piece of the success.
He really saw them as partners, it sounds like.
Yeah, and he invested in the workplace environment. Subsidized hot meals in a cafeteria.
Creating a community.
Totally. There was a company band, the Golden Rule Band. He built Golden Rule Park right next door, playground, benches, bandstand, Golden Rule Hall for meetings. He set up cooperative insurance for sickness and accidents, later a trust fund for families.
And he banned child labor and started a kindergarten.
Yep, no kids working there. And the kindergarten was for employees' children. He saw it as giving them a head start, teaching respect early on.
This detail about getting rid of supervisors and time clocks is amazing too. Workers just kept their own time.
Complete trust. Believed in their dignity, their responsibility. And he wasn't anti-union either. He encouraged unionizing, marched with his workers in Labor Day parades.
So it wasn't just like nice gestures, it was a fundamental belief system. The sources quote him, "The business of this shop is to make men. The making of money is only an incidental detail."
That line says it all, doesn't it? People over profit. And doing all this, especially during a depression, well, that's how he got the nickname Golden Rule Jones. It built him this huge reputation in Toledo.
And that reputation obviously carries him into politics. 1897 runs for mayor, as a Republican, interestingly.
Yeah, and he wins, mainly because the working class knew about Acme and trusted him.
But he wasn't exactly a typical Republican mayor, was he?
Oh, not at all. His progressive ideas, his, let's say, tolerance for things like saloons, he saw them as the poor man's club, needing help, not just shutting down and refusing to crack down on Sunday blue laws. That really ticked off the conservatives and a lot of the moral reformers.
So much that his own party ditched him after just one term.
Yep. The Republican machine refused to renominate him in 1899.
Which leads to this defining moment. He runs anyway as an independent.
Under that amazing slogan, principle before party, and wins in a landslide.
Yes.
Gets, what, 70% of the vote?
70%.
That's
Yes,
something.
both parties. That's incredible popular support.
He did it again in 1901, won again in 1903, served right up until he died in office in 1904. This independent streak was central to who he was, but it also caused problems down the line. Like his friend Brand Whitlock, who actually became mayor after him, said everybody was against him but the people.
That quote just nails it. Let's dig into the philosophy driving all this. The Golden Rule wasn't just for business, obviously.
No, it was his bedrock, his core ethic. He genuinely tried to apply it everywhere. Factory floor, city hall, even in police court decisions.
Yeah.
He saw it as this universal practical guide.
And it wasn't just a simple motto floating in space. He had some serious intellectual influences behind him.
He definitely did. He specifically rejected the whole gospel of wealth idea. Being rich means God likes you best.
Right.
Instead, he embraced the social gospel. That was this movement focused on using Christian ethics to fix society's big problems. Poverty, inequality. It was about action, systemic change based on faith.
So religion as a force for social justice.
Exactly. And one key figure for him, the sources say, was Reverend George D. Herron. Jones read Herron, who pushed Christian socialism and argued that sin is pure individualism. That apparently really hit Jones hard after seeing the '93 Depression, made him ditch his earlier individualist ideas.
Makes sense. Seeing that kind of suffering could change your perspective on every man for himself.
For sure. He was also reading people like Leo Tolstoy. They even wrote to each other, shared ideas on pacifism, critiquing society, and he loved Walt Whitman's poetry, that democratic, egalitarian spirit.
So it's this mixed ethics, a kind of social Christianity, humanist thought.
Yeah, it created this coherent philosophy. It wasn't just sentiment. It was aimed at changing the system.
So what were the core beliefs that came out of all this?
Okay, number one, a deep, fundamental belief in equality for everyone, period. Number two, a huge focus on labor rights, fair wages, decent conditions. That came straight from his own life and what he did at Acme. Three, real commitment to social justice, helping the poor, the unemployed, the marginalized. You see that in his mayoral actions. Four, fiercely anti-corruption, hated the party machines, hence principle before party.
And that idea about society being connected.
Yes. Number five, this powerful sense of collective responsibility. He kept saying things like, no prosperity for some without, For all, society is a unit. That flew directly in the face of the dominant individualism of the time.
Equality, labor, social justice, anti-corruption, collective good. Yeah, those definitely sound like values that resonate with progressive movements today.
They absolutely do. Which brings us to something really important, a potential point of confusion our listener absolutely needs to nail down.
Yes. The New Right book title situation.
Exactly. Because if you just search online for Samuel Milton Jones' The New Right, you might find these descriptions saying the book argues for, like laissez-faire capitalism. Totally contradicts the man.
It sounds like the exact opposite of him.
It really does. So let's be super clear. Samuel M. Jones did write a book called The New Right. It came out in 1899.
Okay. And the actual book from 1899 tells a very different story.
Completely different. The full title is The New Right, a plea for fair play through a more just social order. And the table of contents. It's got chapters like the right to work, the competitive system of failure, arguing for public ownership of trusts, asking, should a city own itself?
That sounds like Jones advocating for public ownership, questioning the system.
Exactly. The preface says the whole point is promoting the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man and pushing for a more just social order. This is his real book. It's a progressive text, social justice, public ownership, cooperation.
So those other descriptions are just wrong, maybe confusing it with something else.
Almost certainly. Probably bad descriptions slapped onto modern reprints of a public domain book. Or maybe, confusion with a totally different, much later book from 2019 by Michael Malice, also called The New Right.
Okay, this is critical for anyone vetting him. You got to know which New Right you're talking about.
Vital, and it's a perfect example of why you have to check your sources, go back to the original if you can. Don't just trust a random online summary.
Good point. Okay, that clears that up. Back to his mayoral AT. This independent path he took, principle before party. What were the practical consequences?
Well, on the one hand, it cemented his image. Incorruptible, principled, the people's guy. That's why he won those huge elections. People trusted him, not the parties.
He definitely had the voters behind him.
Massively. But politically, it cost him. By refusing to wheel and deal, refusing to play the party game, he often couldn't get the votes he needed in city council for his biggest ideas.
So being popular wasn't enough to pass major legislation.
Not for the really controversial stuff, like his big push for municipal ownership, getting the city to own the utilities, the power companies, the streetcars. He fought hard for it, but the corporations and their political allies fought back harder. His proposals, like for a city-owned power plant, got defeated in council, even lost a referendum.
Highlights that classic tension for reformers, right?
Oh.
Sticking to principles versus building the coalition needed to actually win legislatively.
Exactly. It's a tough balance.
And his opposition was pretty wide-ranging. Business, politicians, even some reformers.
Oh yeah, a powerful lineup. The business elites hated him, called him a crackpot, a communist, a socialist, saw him as a direct threat to their bottom line.
Understandable from their perspective.
And the party machines, of course, saw him as undermining their entire power structure.
And the moral reformers you mentioned, why were they against him?
Many clergy and moral reformers,
Yeah.
They criticized his laxity. His refusal to enforce the Sunday blue laws strictly, his tolerance for saloons, and especially his approach in police court. They thought he was too soft, too compassionate, not focused enough on punishing individual sin. He really challenged the status quo on multiple fronts.
The sources even mentioned that some hardcore socialists weren't fans either, because he wasn't following strict Marxist theory.
Right. He just didn't fit neatly into any ideological box. He was his own unique blend.
How did he stack up against other famous reform mayors back then, like Hazen Pingree in Detroit or Tom Johnson in Cleveland?
Good comparison. Pingree and Johnson were also successful businessmen turned reformers. They also pushed for municipal ownership, were influenced by thinkers like Henry George.
And they knew each other, right? Jones and Johnson.
Yeah, they were friends, campaigned for each other. Lincoln Steffens, the famous muckraker journalist, wrote about both Toledo and Cleveland, admiring their efforts.
So part of a broader movement, but Jones had his own flavor.
Exactly. The sources kind of paint Johnson as more of a practical municipal technician, focused on efficiency, cleaning up government. Jones gets called a philosophical artist, driven more by that overarching golden rule ethical vision.
That makes sense. Okay, let's get specific. How did he actually put the golden rule into action as mayor? What were the concrete policies over his 7 years?
A lot of focus on improving daily life for ordinary folks, especially the poor. He started free kindergartens, specifically mentioning they helped working mothers. He massively expanded parks and playgrounds across the city, built on what he started at his factory.
Really investing in public spaces and kids?
Absolutely. Opened free public baths. Basic hygiene was a big issue. Upgraded the public markets. Provided free lodging for the homeless. He saw these not as charity, but as things the city owed its people. Civic responsibility.
And he brought his labor ideas to City Hall, too.
Yep. 8-hour day for city workers.
Yeah.
And this was clever. He often skipped the usual competitive bidding for city projects, which was often corrupt anyway. Instead, he directly hired unemployed men under this Divide Up the Day campaign. Ensured fair wages, got people working, instead of just padding contractor profits.
Wow, that's a direct attack on both corruption and unemployment.
It really was. But maybe the most radical stuff was in law enforcement and the courts. He famously made the police ditch their heavy clubs, their truncheons, and carry small canes instead.
A symbolic gesture, but powerful.
Totally. A shift away from brute force. He demanded humane treatment in the workhouse. No police brutality.
And the police court stories? There's something else.
They really are. He practiced what people call compassionate justice. He believed petty crimes often came from poverty, desperation, lack of dignity, not just bad character. So he'd often dismiss minor cases, try to find solutions. The famous story: a guy steals bread. Jones finds himself and everyone else in the courtroom saying they all shared responsibility for a society where someone had to steal bread to survive.
Incredible.
And he stopped the police practice of just arresting people on suspicion, which often targeted the poor and marginalized.
That focus on humane treatment, root causes, challenging arbitrary arrests, it sounds incredibly relevant to justice reform debates happening right now.
It really does. It was a completely different way of thinking about law and order for that time. And then, of course, there was that big fight over municipal ownership we talked about.
Taking on the utilities,
Yeah.
gas, electric, streetcars.
Yeah. He was adamant. These are essential services. They should belong to the public, benefit everyone, not just generate private profit. But man, the opposition was fierce. Corporate money, political influence. It was a constant battle.
And that led to that great exchange about the rule of gold.
Perfect example. Jones vetoes a streetcar franchise deal. The company lawyer tries to mock him, bringing up the golden rule sarcastically. Jones fires back something like, "Mr. Smith, this kind of government driven by corporate greed is what happens when the rule of gold is in charge." He framed it explicitly. Golden rule public good versus the rule of gold private profit.
Okay, powerful stuff. Let's use all this now to really vet him for that 2025 Progressive Award. How does he look through today's lens, keeping the history in mind? Areas like race, immigration, women's rights.
Yeah, this needs careful handling. On racial equality, Jones clearly stated he believed all men were created equal and should be treated that way. Sources call that view liberal avant-garde for the day. He seemed genuinely inclusive towards the diverse ethnic working class in Toledo.
But the key question for a modern group might be, are there documented specific actions against racial discrimination, particularly targeting Black Americans?
That's where the sources are a bit thin. They praise his universal principles and his general inclusivity of ethnic workers, but they don't detail specific campaigns or policies aimed squarely at racial injustice in the way a modern activist might look for. His principles were anti-racist, but the documented actions focus more broadly on class and human dignity. It's a nuance to consider.
Okay, what about immigration? He was an immigrant himself.
And that seems key. His policies, kindergartens, parks, baths, fair wages, would have directly helped immigrant communities who are often the poorest and most marginalized. And his refusal to crack down hard on blue laws, that's seen as respecting cultural differences, not alienating those ethnic working class groups.
Yeah.
So while there aren't specific immigration policies mentioned, his actions and background suggest a welcoming, inclusive stance rooted in his own experience and philosophy.
Right. Now, women's rights, particularly suffrage, a huge progressive era issue.
This is a really important point. In his business, as we said, he was way ahead. Equal pay, benefits, kindergartens for working moms, recognizing women's economic role.
Definitely progressive for Acme.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
But when it comes to women's suffrage, the political fight for the right to vote, the sources we have are pretty much silent. There's a gap there. His belief in equality might suggest he'd support it, but there's no documented evidence of him actively campaigning for it or taking a public stance.
So, advanced on women's economic value, but his position on their political rights during that key suffrage battle is unclear from these sources. That's definitely something a modern group would need to discuss.
Exactly. It shows how even very progressive figures from the past might not line up perfectly with every priority of today. They were products of their time, even the forward-thinking ones.
Okay, let's revisit the controversies and limits. We know who opposed him.
Right. The socialist, Crackpot, communist labels from business,
Hmm.
the fanning class hatred accusations, the criticism from moral reformers about being too lax.
And that wild battle of the two Sam Joneses.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. 1899, ministers bring in this famous traveling evangelist, also named Samuel Jones, specifically to hold revival meetings and attack the mayor's policies and reputation.
A real clash of visions for fixing society.
Totally. You had Mayor Jones pushing the social gospel, fix the system, collective responsibility, and Evangelist Jones pushing individual sin, personal salvation, that root hog or die poor idea, basically. Poverty is your own fault.
And the outcome.
Mayor Jones got reelected in a landslide right in the middle of it all. Suggests the people of Toledo, living the reality of industrial life, preferred his focus on systemic change over just blaming individuals.
But even with that huge popular support, we talked about his legislative limit.
Yes, historians agree, despite being loved by the people, he did not achieve most of what he advocated in terms of big legislation, especially municipal ownership. His hardcore independence, that anti-party stance, while principled, just left him without the reliable votes in council needed to overcome organized opposition.
So inspiring leadership, deep connection with people, but ultimately limited in getting those major policy wins passed. That's a recurring theme for independent reformers, isn't it?
It really is, that tension between principle and power.
Okay, let's talk legacy. How was he seen in his own time? What was his impact then?
Oh, he was a big deal nationally in reform circles. Muckrakers like Lincoln Steffens wrote positively about him. Progressive figures like Clarence Darrow admired him. He corresponded with Tolstoy. His successor, Brand Whitlock, deeply respected him, called him sincere, principled, a true Democrat. And when he died suddenly in office, huge public grief showed how much people loved him.
And how do historians see him now, looking back?
Generally very positively, though with nuance. They recognize him as dynamic, genuinely radical for his era, especially on things like municipal ownership and being anti-party. His ACME practices are consistently highlighted as proof he lived his ethics. They acknowledge the legislative limits, sure, but they stress his unique kind of progressivism, more inclusive, less elitist, really connected to the working class, refusing to just police people's morality.
Did his influence reach beyond Toledo?
Yeah, he and Tom Johnson in Cleveland are credited with really raising awareness in Ohio about reform, which helped lead to later state constitutional changes, giving cities more power, more control over utilities.
And the ultimate historical ranking.
Pretty impressive. Panels of historians in both 1993 and 1999 ranked him the 5th best big city mayor in American history. That kind of lasting recognition really says something about his impact.
Okay, let's synthesize all this for the listener's core task. Vetting Jones for that 2025 Progressive Activist Award. Strengths versus complexities. What are the big positives?
Huge positives. That deep lived commitment to economic justice and workers' rights. Just look at ACME and his city policies. Pioneering stuff. Strong advocate for social welfare, reducing poverty. That incredibly humane, forward-thinking approach to criminal justice reform. Staunchly anti-corruption, anti-machine. His core belief in equality and inclusivity.
Plus, the principled leadership itself, right?
Yeah.
The golden rule as a genuine guide, and that powerful personal story immigrant worked his way up, champions the common person.
Absolutely. All incredibly compelling points for naming an award after him.
But then the complexities, the areas a modern group would need to weigh carefully.
Right. His Christian socialist identity and the strong Christian framing that might need careful navigation for a secular or multi-faith group today, even though it drove his social justice work.
And the gaps we identified earlier.
Yeah, those are significant. The lack of clear, documented evidence on his specific stance or actions on women's suffrage, a major issue of his time, and the silence is a factor. Similarly, on racial equality, his principles were universal, his actions inclusive of ethnic workers, but the sources lack detail on targeted anti-racist actions that are central to modern activism.
So, principled, yes, but the documented record might not fully align with the specific focuses or depth expected today on certain issues.
Exactly. Then there's the legislative effectiveness question. Inspirational, yes, but limited big policy wins against organized opposition. And finally, that potential confusion over the new right book title needs proactive clearing up.
So an inspiring figure, definitely ahead of his time in many ways, but also complex, with limitations tied to his era and his independent political strategy. What's the overall recommendation based on the source analysis?
The analysis leans towards a qualified endorsement, meaning, yes, he's worthy, but the organization needs to frame it thoughtfully and transparently.
How do they do that? What does thoughtful framing look like?
Focus on the core strengths that are timeless. The pioneering ethics, the focus on workers and the poor, the anti-corruption fight, the humane justice vision.
And be upfront about the tricky parts.
Absolutely. Transparently acknowledge the historical context. On women's suffrage, state the lack of documented evidence on his specific stance. On racial equality, highlight his universalist principles as advanced for the time, but note the lack of detail on specific campaigns beyond broad inclusivity, framing it within the evolution of racial justice understanding. And definitely clarify the 1899 book versus any modern confusion.
So the award becomes about recognizing enduring principles like ethical leadership and fighting injustice, not about endorsing every single aspect of a historical figure uncritically.
Precisely. And maybe even use the award to spark conversations about activism's history, how progressive thought evolves, and how we apply those core principles today.
It sounds like this whole vetting process, this deep dive, is actually really valuable for the organization itself. Helps them clarify their own values by engaging with this complex history. Jones certainly gives them a lot to think about.
He really does. A fascinating, complicated, and ultimately, I think, quite an inspiring figure. Took a simple rule and tried to remake a city with it, against huge odds. Not perfect, limited in ways, but that core commitment was powerful.
For activists today, that blend of principle, courage, and connection to the people, even with the complexities, makes him a really compelling figure to study.
A legacy worth grappling with.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive on Samuel M. Golden Rule Jones. We've seen this wealthy industrialist who used a simple ethical rule, the Golden Rule, to become this really radical urban reformer back in the Progressive era. He championed workers, built parks and kindergartens, reformed policing with compassion, fought big corporations over utilities, and took on corrupt political machines, all driven by this deep belief in equality and that society is, well, connected.
But as we've unpacked, he's complex. Faced fierce opposition, didn't win all his legislative battles, and his record on some key issues for today, like women's suffrage or specific anti-racist actions, isn't as fully documented as we might want. A reminder that even trailblazers are products of their time.
For a modern progressive group looking for inspiration, though, he offers this powerful, maybe imperfect, but deeply human model of sticking to your principles, having courage, and focusing on fundamental justice for everyone.
Which leads to a final thought for you to consider, drawn from Jones himself. He said things like, there can be no prosperity for some without there is a possibility for some prosperity for all. Society is a unit. In our world, still struggling with huge inequality and division, how could that simple but radical idea, applying the Golden Rule not just personally, but to our social and economic systems, how could that guide action today?
A really powerful question to mull over. If you want to explore more, maybe look into other progressive era mayors or dig into that social gospel movement.
Definitely lots more to uncover there.